Hi everyone, Jack here. I hope that you're having a pleasant day and you join me today in my living room, and behind me I have this masterpiece here. As you can probably tell, this is a bit of a botched job out of A4 paper, but I am working on a budget here and it will do. On this map then, in black Sharpie, I have drawn on the railways which once crisscrossed the entire island, stretching to all four of its corners. And I'm going to use this map and this pointy stick umbrella to illustrate to you exactly how the Isle of Wight Railways came to be and in what order, how they developed over time, and then eventually how many of them, most of them, disappeared. So we start then with the first railway on the Isle of Wight, which was none of these, was actually over here in Hamstead. Now this is the Hamstead Tramway, and it was built in 1833 by the legendary architect John Nash. Now John Nash, as you may know, was renowned for such architecture as Buckingham Palace and the Marble Arch. In London, of course. But like most Londonians, later on in his life, he wanted to retire to the countryside. And so he came down to the Isle of Wight and bought a property called East Cowes Castle in, well, East Cowes. And that became his mainstay. But he also bought the estate of Hamstead over here. And in 1830, he decided that he wanted to develop this estate. And so he built a horse-drawn tramway to transport goods from the quay up to his estate. And this tramway appeared in 1833, but sadly Mr. John Nash died in 1835, so it is likely that this tramway was only used for about 2 or 3 years. But it still holds the distinction of being the very first railway ever built on the island. We then move on to passenger railways. And the first passenger railway to be built on the Isle of Wight was this one. This is the Cowes and Newport Railway, and it was proposed in 1859 and finished in 1862. When it initially began operating, it had 2 stations. No points for guessing which ones they were. But then in 1871, another intermediate station was added to the line, which was up here. Now this was Mill Hill Station, and you can still see today the remnants of the platform and the railway tunnel. And this was constructed to ferry shipyard workers to and from the docks. Further down the line we have Medina Wharf, which became the main railway dockyard on the island, serving much of the goods to and from the mainland. And here Halt existed from 1895, again to serve workers to the site. And it was very much the same story further down here at the cement mills, where another halt appeared in, we believe, about 1905, although there are some suggestions that one existed here in as early as 1870. One last notable thing then on this line is this little dot here. Now this is Dodnor Lane, Halt, and all we know about it is that it was there in 1896. We don't know when it was built, and we don't know when it disappeared. There are no photographs, and it doesn't appear in any archive footage. It is a bit of a mystery, but according to one sentence in a Maycock and R.Silsbury book, it did exist. Anyway, we move on to railway number 2, or passenger railway number 2. And this is the Ryde to Ventnor line, better known as the Isle of Wight Eastern Section Railway, later known as the Isle of Wight Railway. And this was actually built in stages. The entire line was proposed in 1860, but the first bit to open was the section between Ryde St John's and Shanklin, and this opened in 1864, 2 years after the Cowes and Newport Railway. However, their initial plan was to terminate at a station in Melville Street in Ryde. But when they did open in 1864, thanks to a massive barmy with some landowners, they had to terminate a kilometre south at Ryde St John's on the outskirts of town. In 1866, the line from Shanklin was extended through to Ventnor via a tunnel under St Boniface Down. Of course, the station at Ventnor wasn't exactly ideally placed. It was in a chalk pit above the town itself, much to the disappointment of those Victorian holiday makers, of course, who had to lug their heavy hampers up and down the hill from the town to the station. But no matter, the railway had reached Ventnor, which was of major significance because Ventnor was a huge tourist hotspot, as were Shanklin and Sandown also. So things were initially looking good for the Isle of Wight Eastern Section Railway, later known as the Isle of Wight Railway, but the problems in Ryde would continue to endure. In fact, for about 16 years. Anyway, in the meantime, we move on to the third passenger railway built on the Isle of Wight, and that is this one here. Now this is the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway, and it was proposed in 1868. Now the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway really began the tradition of lines on the island barely turning a profit. It did connect Sandown to Newport, which were two major towns, but along the way there was very little in terms of traffic and population. And so, very soon after that it was proposed, they fell into financial difficulties. In fact, long before the railway even opened. However, the line did eventually open in 1875, which was a good 7 years after it was proposed. But essentially, it was not complete. It terminated at a separate station in Newport, and this station was located near the old mill at the bottom of Pat Lane, which crucially meant that they didn't actually have a junction with the Cowes and Newport Railway at Newport, which was rather embarrassing for a company with the name Newport Junction in the title. But nonetheless, 4 years later, in 1879, they actually crossed Coppins Bridge via viaduct and joined the Cowes and Newport Railway. But by this time, another railway had already been completed into Newport, and that railway was the Ryde and Newport Railway. Now the Ryde and Newport Railway was proposed in 1872, and in stark contrast to the Newport Junction Railway, it was constructed incredibly quickly. It took a mere 3 years to complete, opening in 1875. And of course, if we compare that to the Newport Junction Railway, this one in full took 11 years to complete. Now, by the time the Ryde and Newport Railway had reached St John's, the Pier Tramway, which opened in 1864, had been extended along the Esplanade and then down to St John's itself. And this was to try and bridge that town-sized gap between Ryde Esplanade and St John's. Of course, devoid of any kind of public transport system. But there was a problem with this tramway. You see, trams by nature are rather small and cramped. And with the amount of Victorian holidaymakers coming over, apparently there were quite a few altercations over seating arrangements. You can just imagine these Victorians with their umbrellas whacking each other over the head. So something had to be done. And in 1877, the London Brighton and South Coast Railway and the London South Western Railway, who ran services down from London, had become sick to death of people getting a great service down to the coast, before then crossing the Solent and reaching Ryde Esplanade, where they would all have to be cramped onto a small tram. So they decided to intervene and they built a railway. This railway was the Ryde extension, and it involved tunnelling under the streets to the Esplanade before constructing a pier alongside the tramway and promenade. At the end of the pier was a station which became Ryde Pier Head, and that is now still the terminus of the Island Line today. We move on then to the next railway constructed on the island, which is this one. And this is the Bembridge branch line, and it was proposed in 1874. It took quite a few years to build, which was odd for such a short branch line. But there was a good reason for this. See, the group in charge of building the railway were called the Brading Harbour Improvement Company, and they were also in charge, or it was their job, to recede the waters back from Brading Quay to the mouth of the estuary at St Helens, where what they did was build an embankment across the mouth of the estuary. This controlled the water flow and also allowed them to build a railway across it. Now, this may have been a very short line indeed, in fact the shortest branch line on the island, but it had one major benefit, and that was here at St Helens. Here they built a railway quay, and this quay was incredibly beneficial for the Isle of Wight Railway. You now had an easy and fast means of transporting goods to and from the mainland. We move on then to our next railway, and that was my favourite railway on the island, and that was this one. Now this is the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway, and it stretched from Newport all the way out to Freshwater in the west. It was in fact the only passenger railway that was built out West Wight. Now, the story of the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway is rather convoluted and confusing, but all you need to know, I will narrow it all down, is that the company first held a meeting at Freshwater Bay in 1879, where they first planned out their route of the railway line. Initially, it was to circumnavigate the Freshwater Isle before approaching Freshwater from the northwest and terminating at Blackbridge near Freshwater Bay. But because of problems involving land purchasing and issues with finances, they had to reroute the entire line from Yarmouth down to Freshwater. And they did this by following the eastern contours of the River Yar and terminating at the bottom of Hook Hill. Of course, this was a major compromise and blow for the railway, because they had always planned to terminate in a bay like Tottenham Bay or Freshwater Bay, because of course there be hotels and beaches, and where there be hotels and beaches there also be Victorian holiday makers. The first passenger train ran on the line in 1888, but shortly afterwards the inspectors got involved and decided to take a look at some of the viaducts and bridges that were constructed along the line, and they deemed them incredibly unsafe. So the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway had to go back to the drawing board and revamp all these bridges along the entire section of line. By the time the railway was fit to open in 1889, 1 year later, the FYNR were completely bankrupt. They were so penniless, in fact, that they couldn't even afford rolling stock for their railway. And so operations of the line were immediately taken over by another railway company. And that railway company was the Isle of Wight Central. The Isle of Wight Central was basically an amalgamation of 3 railways on the island: the Cowes and Newport Railway, the Ryde and Newport Railway, and the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway. And basically it was a desperate measure, an attempt to try and get some money out of these lines just through streamlining the entire process. And it did kind of work. We move on then swiftly to the last railway built on the Isle of Wight, and that railway was this one. Now this is the Newport, God's Hill and St Lawrence Railway, better known as the Ventnor West line, and it was opened in 1897, but only as far as St Lawrence. It was then extended into Ventnor in 1901. But when I say into Ventnor, I do use that phrase rather loosely, because although it was initially called, the station that is, Ventnor Town, it was in fact an entire kilometre out of the town. In fact, it was a lot further away than the initial station built by the Isle of Wight Railway in 1866. Now this railway is rather interesting, and the reason for that is because it never really should have been built. After all, it was thought up long after all these other railways had been constructed on the island, and by the 1880s a lot of them were struggling already. And so the prospect of building another line, especially one branching off at Merston, which was in the middle of nowhere, and serving a town which already had a station, was pretty preposterous. But they went ahead and built it anyway. However, it did hold one distinction at least. It was known as the prettiest railway on the Isle of Wight. In 1923 then, railway grouping happened and the Southern Railway took over operations on the entire Isle of Wight Railway network. And with that, Ventnor Town was named Ventnor West, as it should have been because that's where it was, to the west of Ventnor. The lines were streamlined, of course, under the Southern. Many stations were converted to halts. They also brought in an element of standardisation with the Adams 02 locomotives, which of course would become the mainstay for Isle of Wight steam traction. The first closures, though, wouldn't happen until after 1948 and nationalisation of the railway system. Of course, under BR, many railways were closed, and the first one on the island was shut in 1952. And can you guess which one it was? Yes, it was the last one to open, the Ventnor West line. After just 52 years of operation, the line to St Lawrence and Ventnor West had been axed. And to be honest, it was no surprise. It ran at a loss pretty much its entire operational life. The second railway, or I should say railways, to be axed then, the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway and the Bembridge branch line. These were both shut on the same day, in fact, the 20th of September 1953. And there was quite a bit of an uproar about this, especially regarding the Bembridge branch, which was rather short, didn't take a lot of operation to keep running, and during the summer was still rather busy. But nonetheless, BR said no. Now, the closure of the FYNR was pretty much a given anyway, but it did have a knock-on effect for another railway on the island. And this was the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway. See, for many years, the only profitable traffic on this line was a through train called the Tourist. The Tourist ran more or less non-stop between Ventnor through Newport to Freshwater. And of course, to get to Newport from Ventnor, it would have to travel along the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway. When the Freshwater line was axed, so was the Tourist. And the last bit of profitable traffic for the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway also disappeared. And eventually, in 1956, the line shut. We move then into the 1960s and the era of that beloved public figure, Dr. Beeching. And by this time, the only lines that remained were the ones from Cowes to Newport, Newport to Ryde, and of course Ryde down to Ventnor. But they weren't done there, BR that is. More cuts to the island's rail system were on the way. And the next one to close was in February 1966. And this was the entire section from Cowes to Ryde. So that is the Ryde and Newport Railway over here and the Cowes and Newport Railway, gone in 1 month. A month later then, in April of that year, 1966, the section between Shanklin and Ventnor also closed. And that left Ryde to Shanklin. And this is still in operation today as the Island Line. However, in 1966, the White Locomotive Society was formed, which set up base in the old Newport station over here. Now, the line between Newport and Ryde was pretty much still in situ, well, mothballed as they call it. But they had started preserving some old Isle of Wight railway stock, including a locomotive, an Adams 02, called Calbourne. In 1971, though, they were evicted from Newport Station at short notice because the demolition man was about to move in. With the line still being in situ, they decided to move all their preserved stock from Newport down to Haven Street in a heroic event called the Big Move. They then set up site at Haven Street and began the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, which of course is still in operation today and is now being extended all the way back down to Smallbrook, where they then built an interchange station along with Network South East in 1991. The only other notable aspect of the line is this station here, which is of course called Lake. This was constructed in 1987. Anyway, that is my brief-ish history of the Isle of Wight Railways. But of course, it is also just the tip of the iceberg. I haven't even mentioned any of the narrow gauge railways which once were scattered all across the island itself, especially the ones located in old brickworks and cement mills. But I will save that for another day because this video is already long enough. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed that and see you again very soon. All the best.